Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Hello, here we are for another episode in Season 4 of Religion in the American Experience. A little while back, we decided to do a multi-episode series on the history of religious freedom in the United States because, in the museum's way of thinking, it is one of our greatest innovations and key to understanding the country's past, present, and future. In this second episode, we will be talking with Mark Valeri, the Reverend Priscilla Wood Neaves Distinguished Professor of Religion at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, and its director, and author of The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embraced Religious Liberty. Mark, thanks so much for being with us.
Glad to be here. Important topic. Happy to talk about it.
Okay, sort of a terminology question. Is there a difference in your mind between religious liberty, the term religious liberty, and the term religious freedom? If so, what is it? And if not, no worries. Some people have said it. There is a difference and it's important, but others not. What's your opinion here?
Well, I think that originally liberty and freedom meant very much the same thing, sort of dictionary style. But in the 18th century and through the 19th century, the word religious freedom had more power. It had more legal power. It meant a strict freedom from any government intervention into religious practices or the practices of churches, synagogues, mosques, what have you. So it was a legally powerful concept, whereas liberty meant a little bit more an individual's ability to practice their religion and believe what they wanted to believe, and it didn't really have a lot to do with governmental policies. So there's a little bit of a nuance there. It has changed lately, though, because many, especially conservative, Republican-y oriented people, have attached themselves to the term religious liberty to mean not to mean a restriction on government intervention, but to mean more of the rights of people to practice their religion in the public square more robustly. So the creation of this 2025 Religious Liberty Commission had as part of its agenda bringing prayer back into public schools, the 10 Commandments being placed on public places, things like that.
Okay. So when we hear religious freedom, religious liberty today, there may be importance in distinguishing, but I'm guessing also some people just use them interchangeably. Is that fair as well?
I think that's very fair. I think you feel a little bit more of the political power behind religious liberty today.
Okay.
On the right, and a little bit more the religious freedom on the left today.
Okay.
But they're newspapers and journalists often use the words interchangeably.
Okay. That's helpful. Why don't you share with us your professional connection to the topic, the history of religious freedom? I mentioned the book you wrote. What's your connection here?
So I am a historian of religion in early America, which means I do English things as well, because America was part of the Kingdom of England until 1776. So I've been working especially lately on the way in which people describe, especially English-speaking Protestants, English and American Protestants, describe non-Protestant religions. The way they describe those is a key to the opening up of religious liberty, because if you are very, very critical and see non-Protestant religions as a threat and is bad and is dangerous, then you are less likely to promote religious freedom and to keep the government out of restrictions. So my work in this area I'm writing right now an article on Protestant understandings of Chinese religions in the 17th and 18th centuries and how that changes and opens up to an appreciation of the overlap between non-Protestant religions and Protestant uh, religious traditions.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. So, on a personal level, what was your interest in this coming through college and graduate school? Were you always interested in this, in religion and history, or did you find that sometime later in your education?
I actually became really interested in the history of religion when I was an undergraduate at the University of California at Berkeley, and I was a pre-med major and I had to take these humanities courses. So I took these history courses and I gravitated toward the courses that had to do with early modern Europe. And there's so much religious history there, the Reformation especially, and
Sure.
it's play in which theology really had a common effect, in which it wasn't an abstract mind game, it was an actual social reality that had political consequences. And at the time, I was a believing person, a believing Protestant. And so I had a kind of sense that this instinctively that these are important issues.
Right.
That got me into that. And then when I went to graduate school, I gravitated towards American religious history. And it is really hard to do that very long without becoming interested in the issue of religious freedom and the relation
Yeah.
of different religious communities to government and political power.
Okay. From the sciences to religion and history.
Absolutely, like because of a forced humanities course, you had to
Yeah.
take humanities course, and I sat there, and at UC Berkeley at the time, these classes had 400 people in them, and the lectures were performances, and it absolutely uh, appealed to me. It took me away. It really made me
Yeah.
think that this was great.
Yeah. Okay. One of the reasons for those sorts of classes.
Yes.
Um, Maybe you can paint for us the picture of religious freedom in the colonies before the founding. What did that look like?
That's a really good question. So, as I said before, the colonies are part of the Kingdom of England. So they are technically part of of a kingdom that has an established church, the Church of England. It's a Protestant church, but the monarch of England is the head of the Church of England. Taxes are obligatory. Only Church of England clergy people could perform marriages, do much of poor relief, be high military officers, or enter into Oxford and Cambridge universities. So there's a lot of privilege. So American colonists are subjects of that kingdom. They did, however, develop a language of religious freedom early on, especially after 1688, when it felt as though the English government, because of the English Revolution, was much more favorable towards the colonies, especially religiously speaking. And each of the colonies developed their own laws regarding religion and political establishment. The New England colonies never had a formal political establishment, but there was a very heavy social establishment and a lot of laws that privileged the congregational church. These are the descendants of the Puritans. So there was no formal establishment, and they could use the language religious freedom because they weren't part of the Church of England. However, there was a lot of social pressure and a lot of local laws that privileged membership and participation in the Congregationalist Church. Those were the New England colonies. The middle colonies, especially New York, but also Pennsylvania, had an almost de facto situation of religious freedom because there were so many groups mixing around, German-speaking groups, French-speaking groups. There were almost no laws privileging one church over another in Pennsylvania and New York. So it really was a place of pluralism. Uh, I should say, as an aside, none of the colonies ever restricted the practice of indigenous American traditions. They were very clear that, and John Locke was part of this great English political thinker who said that don't mess, if you will, with indigenous religious practices. So there was, interestingly enough, never a suppression of the way indigenous people practice their burial rites, marriage rites, sort of spiritually oriented rituals, things like that. There was some restrictions on Catholic practice outside of, again, the middle colonies had it all, but in New England there were restrictions on the Baptist practices, but it was phrased as political because Catholic and Spain were Catholic countries and were enemies of England, so it was always phrased as a political matter. The southern colonies were a little different. They were the closest to the English style establishment. The Church of England had power there, and there were colonial laws, Virginia and South Carolina especially, that privileged Anglican or Church of England clergy people, which helps explain why the strongest anti-religious establishment language came out of Virginia, Jefferson and Madison. So before the revolution, you would have said there's no formal establishment. It's a little different from the Church of England situation. Therefore, we claim to love religious freedom or religious liberty, but there was a lot of tradition and social pressure and local laws that privileged one church over another.
Okay, that's a super helpful explanation, Mark. Appreciate that.
Yep.
In your mind, and according to your research and work, what are some of the most important ideas in establishing religious freedom in the United States as defined in the Constitution, including the Bill of Rights? And what roles did these ideas play?
That's
Briefly.
huge. That's huge. But so let me just focus on two things in that. And historians love to talk about the relative importance of the two things. One is a Protestant tradition coming out of the Protestant Reformation that defined faith or the hard religious belief as something internal and individual, which meant that the greatest danger to faith was the imposition of external or coercive authority. Since religious practice was grounded in a sort of mental, emotional state of faith, the government interfering with that seemed to be anti-Christian, if you will.
Yeah.
That was a strong strain throughout all the arguments about the establishment of religious freedom, that we do not want to mess with genuine faith by imposing it. That's what Roman Catholics do. That's their argument. That's not mine.
Right.
Therefore, people like Roger Williams from Rhode Island, who was a Baptist and was very strong in this language of individual conscience and faith as being the heart of Christian devotion. People like Roger Williams were really important in putting down, he was earlier before the 18th century, but people drew upon his writings to say that from a Protestant perspective, the imposition of government authority over religious practice or belief is a bad thing. That's one strain. And this goes throughout the 18th century, that a religious establishment and coercive laws are bad for religion.
Right.
Not just for the state. The other side, and these two things come together, is what we call Enlightenment thought, 18th century rationalist thought. John Locke and a host of European thinkers from the 18th century who argued that freedom of conscience is an important natural right. So the language of rights, the rights of people to determine their own ultimate convictions is a part of nature, and every human being has that, and therefore the imposition of government control or regulation over religion isn't so much dangerous for the church as it's dangerous for a good society, a wholesome good society in which people have rights. So I think those two things, that is the priority of individual faith from the Protestant perspective, and then the freedom of conscience as a natural right. Everyone has a right to determine what they believe and their deepest loyalties without governmental authoritative influence. Those two things sort of flow together in the debates about religious freedom in the early nation.
Okay. And these thoughts originated not in the colonies, but in Europe, right? But then they flowed over with people who came. Is that accurate? This was
Yes,
a flowering of these thoughts here. They started there.
absolutely. The Protestant thing was there sort of from the start.
Right.
With Roger
Right.
Williams, 17th century, but that continues to grow and develop. But the Enlightenment thought is they're reading European books and newspapers. They're going over to Europe. I mean, Benjamin Franklin would be a perfect example of someone who's indebted to that form of thought.
Okay. Why don't you, Mark, share maybe a couple of your favorite, most important actors in establishing religious freedom in the United States?
Yeah.
Who are your favorites, and what did they do?
um, Isaac Backus, and who is a Baptist, and they were always against religious interference into religious affairs. They were the ones who were strongest on politics ruins the church, ruins belief. And Isaac Backus was a very highly prolific writer. He was part of the founder of Brown University,
Okay.
and of course in Rhode Island, where there were a lot of Baptists. And Backus had a big influence on the New Englanders to shake them away from this kind of not legal but de facto establishment in New England, sort of saying, don't you see how bad this is? Don't you see how this is contrary to the gospel, to the New Testament? And Backus was very influential on fellow New Englanders. In fact, influenced a guy named Roger Sherman from Connecticut, who wasn't a Baptist, but who argued highly for religious freedom in the constitutional debates for what became eventually the First Amendment and clauses in the state constitutions written during the Revolution. So during the Revolution, South Carolina, Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut are no longer part of England, so they have to establish their own constitutions and are not yet a nation.
Right.
So they each have constitutions. And Sherman was important for Connecticut's constitution, but most of those constitutions had clauses at the beginning that affirm principles of religious freedom and liberty. The two people that probably had the most influence were James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. I said before, they come out of Virginia, where there is this strong Church of England establishment, and they are very, very afraid of especially the role of taxes, that the government taxing people to pay for religious institutions. That seems to be the big issue in Virginia, especially. And so they sort of co-authored something called the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which becomes the model language. It has a lot of the model language for the First Amendment.
Okay.
And people know about Madison and Jefferson a lot, but I think they're important. That there's one other small little person, not a small person, but another small incident. In 1790, George Washington wrote a letter to a Jewish synagogue in Rhode Island, the Truro Synagogue of Newport, in which he said, this nation welcomes you brothers and sisters in the Abrahamic tradition, than the tradition of Abraham. But we welcome you because we do not have a religious establishment in the United States.
Yes, on the George Washington point, where, as far as I understand, he wasn't very learned like Thomas Jefferson or
Right.
James Madison. Yet, in he seems to have understood sort of deep down that this idea of religious freedom is going to be a very important defining characteristic of this new nation. Where did that come from, do you think?
Well, uh, I mean, he is a Virginian. So he does know, he has read Jefferson and
Okay.
Madison. He knows about this. But number two is, as a military officer and the head of an army, the nation's, the Continental Army, he has to be aware. I don't have any specific evidence for this, but my sense is, as the highest military commander, he has to be aware that many of his troops and soldiers come from Catholic traditions, come from non-Protestant traditions. So he has to have an appreciation for allowing a diversity of religious thought for the good of the common, if you will, crusade in a military sense against Great Britain.
Yeah. And so you think he was persuaded by reading Thomas Jefferson and James Madison that he understood what they were saying and bought into it, as well as this pragmatic um, side that.
Yes, because the Virginia Statute, although it's based on reading and learning itself, the statute is fairly accessible. It is not very technical language. It's very readable, and he would have certainly known about it.
Yeah. Okay. What are one or two of your favorite stories during the effort to establish religious freedom in the United States that also reveal significant aspects of it?
Mm. Well, in my work, I've been talking about, as I said before, about different religions and how attitudes towards different religions shape attitudes towards religious freedom. And one of my favorite stories has to do with the Muslim nations of Morocco and Tripoli, believe it or not. Now,
Okay.
this is before 1801, the United States went to war with the so-called Barbary states because of maritime issues and piracy. But this is before that. Morocco was the first nation to recognize the independence of the United States. And the American leaders realized that and recognized that. In 1797, the United States established a treaty with Tripoli, which is today the nation, basically the background to the nation of Libya,
Okay.
this North African nation. And there was some controversy about this supposedly Protestant Christian nation establishing a diplomatic relationship with the Muslim nation. And John Adams wrote this. I'm going to quote because I just love this quote. So he writes this to the leaders of Tripoli. The government of the United States is not founded on the Christian religion, and there shall never be any case to go to war with another nation because of religion. And that just leapt out at me, that where he says, we are not a Christian nation. We have a lot of Christians, but we recognize the validity of your nation with its Islamic background, because that's not part of our international relationship ideas. And that story has always struck me as a wonderful key moment in this movement towards religious liberty or freedom.
Yeah, that's fascinating. What was the reaction in the United States to that language? Do we know? Did people talk about it?
Uh, on the formal governmental diplomatic uh, level, there was no great pushback or controversy. And I do not know uh, the reaction in, let's say, local churches, but I do know this, that in the 18th century, there is a fairly non-judgmental approach to Islam. There is kind of appreciation of the learnedness of many Muslim scholars. The United States wants to establish trading relationships with these North African states and the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey, to simplify it overly much.
Right.
So because of that, I have this story of a school teacher who went around New England in the 1750s, and I read the notes of his book that he carried around to teach students from. And he has a page of notes on Islam. And his description of Islam is not critical, it's not judgmental, it's not dark and brooding. It's this sense, oh, they believe, and the Muhammad revealed this. He lays out 8 precepts. I'm not sure that they're totally catch what Islam was, but there was a sense in 18th century America that Islam's not a problem. Catholicism was the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now we have we're going to jump ahead. We have the Constitution with its Article 6, no religious test for office. And then we have, after ratification, the Bill of Rights, which includes the 2 religion clauses in the First Amendment. So the day after, what did religious freedom look like in the new nation
Oh,
compared to what it looked like before?
yes,
In a word.
in a word, make it quick. So one knows this on 2 levels: looking at the state constitutions that are become the governing documents for the states, and then looking at the Bill of Rights. One could say that all the state constitutions, as I said before, affirm religious freedom in principle, but places, the New England states, do have tax provisions to provide money for quote unquote religious education, teaching the Bible in school, having universities that have theological seminaries, Harvard Divinity School, Yale Divinity School. And so there is a fairly heavy amount of Protestant establishment in educational institutions, in the prominence of churches, in the fact they would be almost very hard to be elected to public office if one was not a practicing, believing Protestants. And the state constitutions also require, most of them require some sort of religious affirmation to hold public office. The religious affirmation is very thin, such as you need to believe in a God, not a God, in God, meaning the God of the Bible, to very complete and thorough, such as in South Carolina, where you had to believe in the Christian notion of the Trinity. God is 3 people, a Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So I would say in the early nation, you have the principle of religious freedom, no national establishment. So there was never a national church. That's the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And a general sense that the government cannot prohibit any form of religious practice that doesn't otherwise violate the law. I think that's true, and I think we kind of underappreciate the fact that those are real legal protections. However, it is a Protestant nation on a local level.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Why don't you give us, if you can, 2 or 3 essential or key religious freedom events between the founding era and now? What are some things that have been important to define this idea of religious freedom as captured in the Constitution, Bill of Rights?
So you remember what I just said, which is the principle of religious freedom, especially encoded in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause and the free exercise clause. Those two things exist on a federal level, but the state constitutions encode requirements for office and can sort of inhibit non-Protestant practices, non-Christian practices especially, on a state level.
Right.
In 1868, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which is called the Equal Protection Clause. That prohibits states from passing laws that violate the Constitution, the notion of rights in the Constitution. That is, I think, super important because it shapes, now I'm just talking about Supreme Court legal doctrine, that shapes all the debates about religious practice and government interference from that point on. So in 1947, the Supreme Court decided the Everson versus the Board of Education, which prohibited states funding private religious schools on their own. And they referred to this 14th Amendment. It goes on. In 1963, the law that basically outlawed the mandatory Bible reading in public schools, the case of Abington v. Shemp, also referred back to this 14th Amendment. So I think that was a huge thing.
Okay.
Saying even though we don't have a national establishment, and you individual localities or states cannot pass laws that violate the First Amendment.
Why did it take so long from 1868 to, when was the first case you mentioned, almost mid 20th century, for this to come up? That's an interesting question in my mind. Is it just sort of the culture didn't challenge things until then? And if so, why then?
I think your instinct is absolutely right. The broad cultural and social issues did not challenge them. And a little diversion here. Do you have time for a little diversion here?
Absolutely.
So the main religious freedom cases that came before Congress in the 19th century concerned Mormonism and the practice of polygamy in the territory of Utah. So before Utah was admitted as a state, it was a territory. It had to, if you will, undo its doctrine of plural marriage to conform to United States laws. And there was a pressure, in other words, not to be totally religious freedom-y
Right.
in the late 19th century, because it felt as though the nation was growing, it was anxious about all these new territories, all these new people. It had a sense of wanting to control and have some oversight over cultural, social, and religious expansion.
Okay.
I think that's helps explain it.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Two other quick events.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
The election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, first Roman Catholic elected to office, was a watershed moment. I think it showed that there was no longer this sense of America was a Protestant nation and Protestant establishment. And I think one could not ignore in 2015 the Obergefell v. Hodges case, which made gay marriage. It was states were not allowed to prohibit gay marriage.
Yeah. And important here because marriage rooted in religion.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the objection to gay marriage came as a sort of theological point,
Right.
not.
Yeah. Okay. Two quick questions before our final question. What do you think, Mark, the American public gets wrong about their understanding of the history of religious freedom, if anything?
Yes, there are many things. So one I would say is the sense that you have good people who are for religious freedom always fighting against religious proponents of some form of political religious cooperation, and that it's a struggle for the good advocates of religious freedom to win. I think that's a little bit misunderstands the complexity of the legal issues. The Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, and the Religious Freedom Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, the First Amendment. Those two clauses create a lot of legal problems. They 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 don't yield themselves to really easy answers on what kind of religious practices should be allowed when they come close to violating the law, or they do violate the law. The use of peyote in indigenous American religious services, polygamy, back to the Mormon case. So the first thing I think people get wrong is by saying, oh, well, there's a cast of good characters and a cast of bad characters, and it's just a clear in every case who's who. And I think it's more complicated than that, and which is why there's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think the second thing people get wrong is a kind of quasi unthoughtful belief that America is an exceptional place when it comes to religious freedom, that we are an exceptionally religiously free place. I think that the history of European nations, even though, let's say, uh, Great Britain has a formal religious establishment, the monarch is still the head of the Church of England. There's a lot of religious freedom in the United Kingdom today. So I think the notion that the United States is really unique here is a bit of a mistake, and we need to think comparatively a little bit more about this. The third thing I think we get wrong is I think that Americans who claim that this is a Christian nation and that there is a kind of validity to the notion of religious nationalism, that we are grounded in Christian identity and therefore a religious nation, we should continue to affirm that and support that, misreads the founders completely. My letter that I read of John Adams to Tripoli, in which he says, we are not a Christian nation. That doesn't mean we're not a lot of Christians. There's not a lot of Christians here. It just means that governmental political identity is so different in the founders' minds from the aspirations of individual churches to have moral sway or something like that.
Okay. All right. And then flip side of this coin, what do you think the American public gets right about the history of religious freedom?
I do think it gets right that there are improvements on the European pattern, especially in the 18th century, that there is more religious freedom here. That social and political fact is often overwhelmed in today's history writing by a sense of a kind of racialized, hegemonic oppression of African American people. Absolutely yes. Indigenous American people. Absolutely yes. In the 19th century, Asian immigrants. There is that. There's no question. But I think that story shouldn't eclipse the notion that there is a genuine opening up of religious diversity and pluralism. And I think we are religiously very plural nation. And that should be appreciated for as a result of religious freedom.
Okay. All right, Mark, last question as we conclude. Do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from the topic, this topic, of the history of religious freedom, either in terms of important historical transformations you have noticed, or in terms of helping us better understand and participate in our present moment in the American narrative?
Mm, mm, mm. Well, I didn't hint, I said this before. I think that claims about Christian nationalism or religious nationalism are a great misreading of our history and a great misleading of our not only constitutional thought, but our political strengths and our political solidarity with each other. So one lesson I would take away from this is talk of Christian identity is certainly true on the level of the United States population, statistically, although it's declining. But that should not be, which many politicians do, easily slurred into a kind of notion that the government and its political identity should be Christian and its laws should somehow promote Christian teaching in one way or the other. I think that's what concerns me most at the present. What I am doing personally, again, is charting this changes in attitudes towards non-Christian religions, non-Protestant and non-Christian religions, and seeing how that happens and how that opens up. And it's clearly through encounter, exposure, and knowledge. The more we know, the better about different religious traditions. And that will help us understand and see that religious freedom or liberty is not a jeopardy to the American experiment.
Okay, Mark, you have the last word. Thank you for that. We have been talking with Mark Valeri, the Reverend Priscilla Wood Neaves Distinguished Professor of Religion at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and author of The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embraced Religious Liberty. Mark, thanks so much for being with us. It was super. What you shared with us, I think we are all now better equipped to be better stewards of religious freedom's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government.
Happy to do a good conversation. I appreciate it, Chris.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private Digital First National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.